The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Payam-Cowichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement that's authored by the USC Van Hunnik History Department, we encourage you to visit their website, and I predict my colleague Maya has already popped that link into the chat, or they will shortly. So as Maya has already let those of you who are joining us online know, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you want to know what Indigenous territory you're on, they will be posting a link where, no, I'm not. This is the microphone. Thank you all. They will let you know where you can see what Indigenous territory you're on. And remember, when you're typing in the chat, there's a little drop down to select whether you're chatting with everyone or just the host and panelists. So keep that in mind. So my name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm truly happy to welcome those of you in person and those of you online. Thank you for joining us. I want to say a few words about the Zoom protocols. First of all, for our attendees online, you are currently viewing the speaker and the slides in a side-by-side format. And the great thing about this feature is that if you click on the dividing line between these, you can make the slides or speaker bigger or smaller as you wish. So please keep that in mind. We will have time for questions and discussion, so we invite and encourage everyone's participation in the room and also online. Online, you can ask questions in the chat, using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, or you may be able to ask questions on audio if you wish to by clicking the raise hand button. Please keep in mind when considering how to pose your question that we are recording it, this lecture, and the recording will be made widely available on our YouTube channel, our website, our monthly newsletter. So if you have concerns about privacy, please keep that in mind when you're thinking how to pose your question. And we're going to do our best to answer as many questions as we can. My colleague Maya will be moderating those questions that are coming in. So now, to introduce today's lecturer and speaker, allow me to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Garen Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Maya and Yamur, for the preparation of the lecture, and everybody. Welcome to everybody here in the room and on Zoom. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research was founded in 2014 and has concentrated its efforts on developing an innovative interdisciplinary research agenda focusing on 3 distinct areas which were under-researched. One, resistance to genocide and mass violence. Second, violence, emotion, and behavioral change. And thirdly, the digital genocide studies. The center organizes a rich academic program each year holding an international conference. And by the way, next year we actually hosting two big international conferences, one of the International Network of Genocide Scholars in June, and then we co-host in November the biggest international Holocaust conference here at USC. We are also hosting numerous scholars and residence, fellows and visiting scholars, and we offer other research opportunities. And one of the main features of the center is our fellowship program, and we are very grateful to Margee and Douglas Greenberg, who were the first donors of a fellowship which was established at the center right after its inception in 2014. The Margee and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellowship is awarded annually to an outstanding advanced standing PhD candidate from any discipline and anywhere in the world for a dissertation research focusing on the testimonies of the USC Shaw Foundation Visual History Archive or other unique USC research resources in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. So it's my special pleasure to introduce you to our current Greenberg Fellow, Raíssa Alonso. She is a PhD candidate in social history at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and we are really glad to have our first fellow from Brazil here. She earned her BA in history and her MA in social history at the same university, the University of São Paulo. She has deep experiences working with survivor testimonies and related resources, not only from her research on her master thesis, which drew on police archives from the 1930s, but also from her experience serving as a volunteer and associate researcher on a project to record and preserve testimonies and related documentation from Holocaust survivors who took refuge in Brazil. The project, organized by the Laboratory of Studies in Ethnicity, Racism, and Discrimination at the University of São Paulo, resulted in an online database which is called ArcShoah, the Virtual Archive of Holocaust and Anti-Semitism. She has received a CAPS Foundation scholarship from the Ministry of Higher Education in Brazil for her research. She presented on her research at conferences and seminars across Brazil, but she just shared with me that this is her first international lecture. So we are very proud to host this premiere. Just to mention that she also works as an editor for a leading textbook publishing house in Brazil, where she is editor-in-chief for a history textbook for children ages 7 to 10, and a consultant and reviewer for several other history collections. So please welcome Raíssa Alonso.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. Those of you who braved the rain to be here, and also the people who took time to be on Zoom with me today. My name is Raíssa Alonso. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of São Paulo, and I'm very happy to be here today doing this presentation. Before I begin, I would like to thank Marta, Wolf, Maya, and everyone from the center for their assistance in this last month. I would also like to thank the support of my wonderful advisor, Professor Maria Luísa Tucci Carneiro, who has been guiding me for a long time now, and the continued support of the Brazilian government agency CAPES. And finally, I want to thank once again Margee and Douglas Greenberg for this wonderful fellowship. Without it, it wouldn't be possible for me to be here today. So, let's begin. As the Nazis assumed power in February 1933, many artists and intellectuals opposed to the regime saw no other option but emigration to escape political and/or ethnic persecution. Crossing the Atlantic was no easy choice. The American continent still suffered a reputation of being less civilized than Europe. And some countries fared better in this aspect than others. The United States was considered by most their preferred destination. And while the US received over 130 German refugees during the Second World War, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil received considerably high numbers themselves. In Brazil, for instance, some researchers estimate that more than 30,000 refugees were welcomed between 33 and 45, which, may not be the highest number of all, but it amounted to roughly 30% of the German Brazilian community at the time. So, many of these refugees, they found themselves unwilling to abandon ties with their homeland. The suffering of many Germans and the people they left behind weighed heavily on their minds. Artists, intellectuals, cultural workers in general were particularly affected by the destruction not only of lives, but also the defiling of German culture. So when they came to the American continent, they took it upon themselves to create anti-Nazi movements in their newfound home. Here in the US, two main cities received high-profile writers, scientists, artists, and intellectuals, New York and Los Angeles. LA received so many important German exiled individuals that they received the moniker of Weimar in the Pacific. Marcuse, Adorno, Schoenberg, almost the entire Mann family, Leon Feuchtwanger, those names, they were recognized among Germans everywhere. As you can see, there were organized anti-Nazi movements in the United States, but also in practically every other country on the American continent, from Canada to Uruguay. In this lecture, though, I'm going to focus on 3 Latin American groups. The reason for this choice is that only 2 of those groups became close to forming a unified anti-Nazi front in the American continent, the Das Anti-Deutschland movement in Argentina and the Freie Deutschland movement in Mexico. I wanted to understand why that alliance didn't happen. The thing is, I think that by including Brazil and the United States in this conversation, it will help me understand better what happened. Because you see, I started working with Brazilian anti-Nazi movement in my MA in São Paulo. And in every bit of the research, it indicated that they were very invested in the idea of unifying both fronts. And while I was, studying the newsletters that I found, I realized that there was a specific excitement announcement made by its leader in 1943. He had received a letter from Thomas Mann himself, congratulating him on the creation of his movement. So if you search for Thomas Mann on the National Archives of Brazil, you will find several articles about how Mr. Carlos Ciprián, who had corresponded with Thomas Mann, had heard from the famous writer that one day he meant to visit Brazil, at least in some point of his life. And with that, I had a sort of revelation. Those movements sought the approval of those exiled here in America. How could they not? A word of approval coming from the likes of Heinrich or Thomas Mann meant the world to anyone with a minimal interest in the arts. And while these people were interested in preserving German culture abroad, for the most part, they didn't have the same status as Thomas Mann had. Mr. Lustigbrand, for instance, he was a theater director. Sure, he directed the Vienna State Opera, but I think he would have loved to hear his name mentioned in the same breath as Thomas Mann. A compliment from, any of those refugees here in the United States would be published in their newspapers like a badge of honor or as a sign of their just cause. And so there was another central theme common between all of these anti-Nazi movements, the idea of the other German. Also known as the Two Germany theory, the concept became a unifying point between the German artistic and intellectual community abroad. It has been defined once by Professor Aglox as a sort of anti-fascist humanism. To put it rather simply, the other Germany was the idea that Hitler and his Third Reich did not embody the true morals and values of Germany. After all, this was the country of Schiller, of Goethe, and of a long humanist tradition that was thrown away by the Nazis in favor of militarism, eugenics, and book burning. So it fell to the artists and the intellectuals and all the concerned German citizens abroad to uphold the values of the true Germany, to preserve the country's images before the other nations, to be able to reconstruct it after the Nazi regime fell. And how to do that? This was mostly done by publishing newspapers, manifests, hosting cultural events in German, promoting German literature, theater, and music. They also hoped to engage with previously established German communities abroad to educate them on the horrors and the dangers of the Nazi regime. So the Other Germany started as a magazine in the Weimar era, but the term was first used to mean this existence of another Germany, of anti-Nazi Germany, in 1934. Heinrich Mann, when he inaugurated the Free German Library in Paris, used the term for the first time. And after that, in 1936, Klaus and Erika Mann wrote a book called The Other Germany. It was based on a series of talks and lectures they gave across the United States, and where they explained the concept very carefully and also made sure that 2 points came across. First of all, not all Germans were Nazis. And second of all, fascism can happen anywhere, even in the United States. So, as you can see, those 2 points, they were replicated on many anti-Nazi movements throughout America. So it's not unreasonable to think that their book and their ideas circulated throughout the continent. And, you know, there can be many reasons as why there was never an anti-Nazi front in the American continent. I guess some of them were practical, some geographical, political, and honestly, I think there may even be some petty reasons in the mix. But I also believe there were ideological reasons related to the Other Germany concept that made the front impossible. It made sense, you know, to me to try and understand what those people in their movements were talking and discussing with the ones in the United States who practically invented the concept. And well, that's my explanation to focus on Latin American groups. But before I actually move on to presenting them to you, I would like to highlight that it was no easy or safe decision for most of these refugees to start the anti-Nazi movements in their countries. Many of the countries in Latin America were under authoritarian governments, and well, even those who weren't, they did not exactly welcome refugees. So I love this cartoon. It was published in the Das andere Deutschland journal in 1946 when they were discussing, you know, what to do with Germany after the war. And as you can see, it shows a concerned citizen, I think from Britain, saying that the whole German people should be wiped out for, you know, the horrors of the concentration camps. And well, they put in a message that says, don't forget, some of us are German too, friend. So I think, you know, this was a sentiment shared by, you know, many Germans in many countries who have suffered with the prejudice of all the difficulties they faced in their new refuge home. In the United States, democratic values, they granted some political freedom for, you know, organized action here in LA and in New York. But, you know, this freedom was sort of limited because we know that the FBI surveyed both Heinrich Mann and Leon Feuchtwanger because of their connections to the Mexican movement. And what was interesting for me to discover is that the reasons they did that were, you know, the same reasons that the Brazilian military dictatorship surveilled their anti-Nazi movements, which were fear of communism and, you know, fear of them being subversive and disruptive and, you know, corrupting the American citizens. Those were the same accusations that anti-fascists everywhere, you know, were suffering. And there were aggravating penalties to being German or Italian or Japanese, because those subjects were considered, as one of the agents of the Brazilian political police puts it, loyal Axis subjects. So these communities were placed under, you know, particularly harsh surveillance. Even if they were fleeing from the Nazis, most Germans were considered Nazis until proven otherwise. So let's start with the overview. First, we have the Das andere Deutschland, or the Other Germany movement in Argentina. It is the oldest of the three movements, created in 1937 out of the desire of many immigrants and Germans to have a unified anti-Nazi front in the country. They had no formal leader and three main goals: offering financial aid to German refugees, spreading the word of the horrors committed by the Nazis, and hosting events related to the true culture of Germany. The main founder was August Simse, who was a German historian and ex-deputy of the SPD. He had come to Argentina in 1936 after a brief exile in Switzerland. He worked at the Pestalozzi School in Buenos Aires, which was founded by the editor of the main newspaper written in German in Argentina, which was the Argentinisches Tageblatt. This paper actually lasted until January of this year, and the Pestalozzi School exists until today. This school was used to host most of the cultural events there. And in 1938, when they moved to a bigger building, they received congratulations from Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Leon Feuchtwanger, Thomas and Heinrich Mann, among other prominent figures. And the likes of Stefan Zweig and Emil Ludwig were invited to give special lectures in the school, and they came. This movement had affiliated local anti-Nazi movements in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Uruguay. And I think many others, but these were, the main ones. And in Uruguay, they actually hosted an anti-Nazi Congress in 1943 in their own, attempt to unify the anti-Nazis in the continent. They had their own newspaper, which was the Das andere Deutschland, written both in German and Spanish. And it was distributed all over South America. Finding this newspaper here was one of the things that excited me the most, because some of it was digitized before, but not those volumes, and there are over 70 volumes here. So, I hope it contributes, to tracking down the network and how it was formed, who was writing. So, yeah. In the cultural front, they promoted, German-speaking events, theater, music. They used to do shows with Brecht plays and also Eisler songs, and they were an important cultural institution in Buenos Aires. They were more of a left liberal tendency with a little bit of socialism. They at one point welcomed communists, but when they had the pact in 1941, the Hitler-Stalin pact of no aggression, those communists were expelled from the group, and they formed their own newspaper. They had a distinction between political immigration and non-political immigration. Political immigration were those who were persecuted by their political beliefs, and the non-political one, they were persecuted on the race basis. This put them in conflict with an important anti-Nazi organization run by Jewish people, the Jüdische Wochenschau, which are not very, studied. They are mostly appear tangentially in the historiography. But I actually found two testimonies here in the VHA who contributed a lot, to the to knowing better the history of its founding member, which was who was a rabbi, and he smuggled people out of Germany to Buenos Aires. So it was very interesting. In Argentina, the political climate was awful. They were living in what is called the infamous decade, a series of conservative governments, with lots of electoral frauds, and would end in 1943 with a military dictatorship, where, everything got worse. And most of the members of the DAG were persecuted, and Simpson himself, he went into hiding and would, eventually leave Argentina in 1952. The newspaper continued until, I think it was 1949. So it ran well after the war, and it was very influential. This one is the Mexican movement, and it's a very particular situation, because unlike Argentina or Brazil, Mexico was not under a dictatorship with fascist sympathies. So actually, it was one of the only countries to support the Democratic Republic of Spain in the Civil War, and it openly welcomed communists like Trotsky in 1936. But there was, some unease and mistrust around the German community because, well, once again, they were considered to be spies and Nazis. So any of the political refugees they received had to be, had their visas granted on the basis of being anti-fascists. Mexico also had their own concentration camp, which is not very well explored in the historiography. The migrant station of Perote was used to hold over 700 German immigrants in a partnership financed by the United States, and there they awaited deportation. So, but by 1942, several important names in the politics and arts of Germany had arrived in Mexico. Leon Feuchtwanger, when his US visa expired, Ludwig Rehn, Alfred Doblin, Anna Segers, Alfred Kantorowicz, and many, many others. And among these arrivals, several were, ex-members of the Communist Party in Germany. And they were brought to the country by the Liga Pro Cultura Alemana, which was the oldest German organization in the country. It was, in English, it's League Pro German Culture. And they were a little bit criticized by their methods because they often involved bribery and, a high cost, a high price for, fake papers. But it was due to them that many, many lives were saved and many visas were granted to enter Mexico. They printed their own newspaper, which ran from 41 to 46. And they rebranded themselves, part of this Liga Pro Cultura Alemana rebranded themselves as the Freie Deutschland movement, or Alemannia Libre, or Free Germans. This newspaper was very important and it received lots of contributions from the United States, Mexico, and also from traditional anti-fascists, in the continent, such as Pablo Neruda or Vicente Toledano. And they had their own publishing house, which was partially sponsored by the government. And one of their biggest accomplishments was to publish El Libro Negro del Terror Nazi in Europa, or the Black Book of Nazi Terror in Europe, which were a collection of testimonies from exiled writers, including Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Leon Feuchtwanger, and others who were affected by the Nazi regime. It was probably the greatest anti-Nazi propaganda ever made in the continent. And it was a big success. Both the newspaper and the Black Book are available here in the library, in the Memorial Library. And well, I didn't get the chance to see the book yet, but before I leave, I will definitely do that. I'm very excited to read it because it's not digitized anywhere. And same with the FG newspaper, because while some of it is digitized, most of it's not. So it was very interesting to have contact with these texts. So anyway, to wrap it up, after the success of the Black Book in 1943, they would launch their own project for a Latin American unification, a united front. They would create the Latin American Committee, which was presided by Heinrich Mann, and whose vice president is a major figure on the Brazilian anti-Nazi scene. But I'll get to that in a moment. First, I have to give a little bit more context to Brazilians' political climate there. So forgive me if I go into a lot of detail. It has been, my main focus of research for the last few years. Well, like many countries, Brazil's history with refuge and immigration is awfully complicated. Because after the empire abolished slavery, the republic, which replaced it in the following year, enacted a policy of actively encouraging Europeans to come to Brazil. This served a dual purpose. First, they have to, settle the sparsely populated countryside, but also they had a plan to, progressively whiten the Brazilian population, which, was a project that lasted well into the 20th century. So most of the German-speaking refugees who were able to escape to Brazil after 33, they came from the upper or middle class, they were well-educated, they had liberal professions, and were mostly left-leaning in their political orientation. They usually settle in big cities like São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, and this all contrasted with the profile of the previous German immigrants. Low education levels, mostly rural backgrounds, dispersed in big cities, but also in the countryside. And many of them still thought of Germany as if it were, permanently stuck in the 19th century. So the 30s and the 40s were not the best time to be an immigrant in Brazil at all. Getúlio Vargas was the president of the Brazil from 30 to 45. And to keep it very simple, he entered in power through a coup, made a very authoritarian constitution in 34, got elected, and before his legal term ended in 38, he claimed that he had uncovered the Cohen Plan, a Soviet Jewish plan to take over Brazil. And in the name of national security, he gave another coup, and he stayed in power until 45. He implemented from 37 on a newer, more fascist constitution in Brazil, which curbed a lot of foreign citizens' liberties in the country. Like, for instance, he passed several laws that didn't allow German people to speak German in the streets or the churches or schools or any kind of group activity. There couldn't be any more written press in German. They had to integrate or leave. And when the Nazi submarines bombarded one of Brazilian ships in March 42, the German community had part of its financial savings confiscated by the banks in order to pay reparations to the Brazilian government. So, well, beyond that, while Brazil did make a commitment in the Evian conference to receive, displaced people from Nazi Germany, he actually enforced a ban on, granting visas to all Jewish people. So it was a secret ban, and all the deputies and consuls were instructed to reject any and all Jewish visas at the meantime. So, not great. I can keep talking about, how awful his government was, but I wanted to present, a very famous case in Brazilian history. It serves to illustrate, the dangers the German community was facing at the time. So, this is Olga Bernario. I don't know how much or if you're familiarized with her story. I don't know if you know her at all, but, well, we learn about her story in school in Brazil. It's probably one of the few openly Jewish characters we study. Some 20 years ago, they even made a movie about her with big Brazilian stars and an even bigger budget. I remember going to see it in theater with my entire 8th grade class. And the movie was a little, in the telenovela style, but, well, it was very, impacting in all the same. I can still quote some of the lines in this movie, so it made, a big impact on me. And she was my first contact with anti-fascist resistance in Brazil. And, well, when I think about it, by the way that my 13-year-old self was impressed, it's not really surprising that I ended up studying anti-Nazi resistance. So who was her? She was a German Jewish woman born in Munich in 1908, and she joined the Communist Youth when she was 15. Well, she coordinated anti-fascist activities in France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And she had some military training, and she was assigned by the Soviet Union as a bodyguard to Luiz Carlos Prestes, which was Brazil's most important communist leader in the 20th century. Leaving the Soviet Union to Brazil, they were supposed to pose as husband and wife. And by the time the ship arrived in Rio de Janeiro, the lie had become the truth, because they were now a couple. They had fell in love, and, but the Brazilian Communist Party, they tried an insurrection attempt in November of 36, and, well, it didn't work. And after that, Prestes and Olga went into hiding, but they were arrested in 36. So Olga had her real identity disclosed by Brazilian diplomats to the Gestapo. Filinto Müller, one of the higher-ups of the political police, was openly pro-Nazi. And the Vargas government wanted to extradite her to Germany, and knowing that she would be killed there as a Jewish and as a communist. But you see, she was pregnant at the time of her arrest. And there was a whole international campaign to stop her extradition. There were protests, and the Vargas government still sent her to Germany anyway. She had a daughter there, which survived, but she was raised by her paternal grandmother. She's now an important historian in Brazil. And well, Olga, she was first sent to Lichtenberg, then to Ravensbrück, and finally to Burburg, where she and hundreds of other female political prisoners were gassed in 42. 42, same year that Brazil joined the war in the side of the Allies. The case was really high profile and impacted the public opinion because now it consolidated the idea of Jewish people as, communist threats, communist spies. And even if she was, a German, she was not a Nazi, she was still a danger to the country. So you now have some idea of what, the German community was facing at the time. So still, ever since 1933, Brazil had anti-Nazi movements. The first one was created in Porto Alegre, which was in the south of Brazil, the heart of the German community. And it was Friedrich Kinsted, who was a German anarchist who had came before the First World War. He started the League for Human Rights, an institution mainly dedicated to root out Nazis from the German Brazilian community. He had a newspaper, Die Action, which ran until 1937 without too many hitches. He had ties with other, movements from the Italian and Spanish communities. But after the coup, he was forced to abandon his position, and he concentrated on, collaborating with the Das and Die Deutschland in Buenos Aires. One of his main editors, Willy Keller, he actually went to Rio de Janeiro and he started a project of his own. But, between 1937 and 1942, because of the repression, there were no, standing out voices in Brazil. We know there were some newspapers, but we don't know much about them. They didn't survive any, significant records. But in January 1942, Brazil cut diplomatic ties with Germany. And it was the first step, to get out of the neutrality state that Vargas had maintained the country. And it made the anti-Nazi community in general feel more comfortable with acting politically. And there were like two main movements who, took the center stage. The first one, the Emergency Committee of German Anti-Fascists, which was the Willy Keller movement in Rio de Janeiro. It was mostly a newsletter that ran from Rio to São Paulo to Porto Alegre and had like articles titled, Hitler is not Germany. And it lasted until 1945. But the second group was called the Movimento dos Alemães Livres, or the Free German Movement, and it happened in São Paulo. It was founded by Carlos Chiprean, and between 1942 and 1943, he would become the recognizable face of anti-Nazi resistance in Brazil. A little more about him. He was born in the Czech Republic, which was at the time Austria, in the end of the 19th century. He came from an aristocratic family, and he was a journalist by profession, but he also, was a theater director. And until 1935, he was directing the Vienna State Opera. But his wife, who was an opera singer, she had Jewish ascendancy, and fearing for their future, the couple left Austria and went to first Switzerland and then Brazil. In Brazil, Chiprean had, friends in high places. He was acquainted with the high society of São Paulo, which included the consul of the United States there, Cecil P. Cross. And he was an odd duck in the political sense, very hard to pin down. Sometimes he was seen as a socialist, sometimes as an old-fashioned conservative, and he was described by the council as a democratic liberal. But some of his letters, well, they revealed a certain fondness for the idea of a return to monarchy. And besides that, he's somehow identified as a German, as an Austrian, and as a Czech, all at the same time, which, confounded most of his friends and enemies. He was known to the political police of São Paulo as the subversive chameleon. His movement, though, was firmly based on the other Germany concept. His main aim was to create an aid society which would help with the war efforts, denounce Nazi collaborators, and host cultural events. And one of his main intents was to show the Brazilian people that not all Germans were Nazi and that they were actually friends and allies. And well, as they put it in their manifesto, which ran into several newspapers, Brazilian newspaper, mainstream ones, that we are beside the Brazilian people in the fight against the forces of evil, says the document, the founding document. His strategy was, so into the respectability politics that, in order to show that there were good Germans, Lustig formally asked permission to the political police of Vargas to start the movement. Well, the political police did not allow them to exist, but they never exactly forbade them, so they, started anyway. And they did put lots of agents to follow and surveil and report on Lustig and also his associates. This tactic had some merit, like in Porto Alegre, instead did the same, and he was very successful because at the time in the office, he met with a man who was passionate about hunting Nazis. But in Rio de Janeiro, it was, a total failure. Like, Willie Keller was dealing with the same people who sent Olga to her death. So, not a great time. But, well, in São Paulo, even if things were a little more ambiguous, Lustig was not afraid to shoot for the stars, because when Brazil entered formally the war in August 42, he sent a telegram to the Minister of Foreign Relations and also the President. So, well, the fact that he had, the American consul as a friend was very important because at some point it was the only thing that, kept him from being deported. This was, an affidavit that Cecil P. Cross wrote for the political police, saying that he was a loyal anti-fascist, freedom-loving, democratic, Catholic. So that was very important for him. But, well, the Movimento dos Alemães Livres had something between 50 members or 300, depends on who you believe. Well, Lustig boasted both to the DAD and FG about these 300 members. But this was one of the most interesting aspects of this group, because while every other organization in Latin America was affiliated either to the FG or the DAD, Lustig claimed to have united both in São Paulo. And he sent a representative to the Congress of the DAD, and even though he hated communists, he was happy to accept a position as the vice president of the Latin American Committee. From his newsletters, it was clear that he desired to unite those movements. Perhaps his desire came from personal gain, which could very well be because, all evidence points to him being a little narcissistic. But I also think that there is more than that. I think that perhaps because he wasn't aligned, with neither the FT and neither the DAD, because, his visions for the future of Europe included return to the monarchy, incorporation of the Sudetenlands to Austria, and a sort of federative, European coalition to keep Germany in its place. It was not about, what the people of Germany wanted, like the DAD or the FT. I think he saw this alliance as a means to an end, defeat Hitler, and that's it. That's the most important thing. His interest in preserving German culture was genuine because he believed it was a duty of all German speakers. And his dream never came true. In June of 43, the police raided and ordered the dissolution of the Movimento dos Alemães Livres. And after complying with the police, Lustigren resigned from the vice presidency of the Latin American Committee. And without his leadership, the São Paulo group became directionless. Kurt Fabian rounded up some followers and affiliated to the DAG, and Stefan Baron became the representative for the FT. There was no more exchange between those groups. So, my final conclusions. When I started this research in Brazil for my MA, I knew very little about these movements. I knew there was a vibrant circle of artists and intellectuals because I worked with the testimonies in Brazil. And my advisor was actually one of the first people to work with the declassified political police files. So she was the one who told me that they were, these movements were criminalized. And I never imagined they would be connected in such a, huge network. But even though they were connected from Mexico to Uruguay, it bothered me that I didn't find a single mention of a united front. And I wondered, did it ever exist? But, Brazil wasn't somehow part of it, or something happened that prevented it. So this is why in my PhD, I tried to uncover a little bit more of what happened. And while I was working to answer these questions, I encountered new ones. And I think my first, questioning on the historiography was like the other German concept was mostly described as a unifying concept of all these movements. And I think actually that this is more of an umbrella term that encompasses different visions under the guise of the same name. I think that's my hypothesis that I'm, trying to prove in my dissertation, that there is an ideological divide between those groups, and that ultimately prevented this alliance from forming. And to me, it's related to the other Germany concept, because the other Germany concept, in their text, those groups try to, answer two questions. How did Germany fall to Hitler's spell? And what will happen with Germany? And what should we do to prevent this from ever happening again? And particularly on the second question, the answers were wildly different. So ultimately, I feel that the conflict over how to respond to these questions was the thing that actually prevented this alliance from forming. And I came here to the United States to work in the special collections and with the Visual History Archive, and to get some insights to these concepts. And although I'm far from finished, from analyzing the materials I found here, I feel confident that they will help immensely in my research. I found so many new possibilities, so many new directions that I could take my dissertation, and I don't know. I'm still gonna have to wrap my head around it. So beyond the connections that those here had with the Mexican movement, it was very interesting to see respectable democracies such as the United States using the same methods and criminalizing those movements as we had in Brazil or Argentina or even Mexico, I guess. I'm very pleased to work with both newspapers that are available here. And I hope to, better find better connections with the movements, with the Brazilian leaderships. And I would like to say something about the Visual History Archive. Some of the testimonials shed light into some obscure parts of the movement's histories. The case of Heinz Geigel, secretary of the Freie Deutschland in Cuba, which is one largely forgotten chapter in the resistance movement. Also with the Jewish communities in both Argentina and Mexico. And while I didn't find any specific connection to my resistance movements, the Brazilian interviews that I encountered in the VHDA are an incredibly rich material for any researcher of the 30s and the 40s. There are many references to main Jewish organizations of São Paulo and Rio, their connection to international ones like Joint and B'nai B'rith, And they also gave me precious insight into the persecution that German refugees, and particularly the Jewish ones, suffered in Brazil under the government of Vargas. They are a treasure trove that just begs for more research, and I hope there will be more people interested in exploring them in the future. So, well, unfortunately, 1 month is not enough time to explore all the wonderful resources that we have here. But I hope that in this lecture, I have given you a brief overview of what consisted the resistance movements in the American continent, and also the significant contributions that my time here has afforded me. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Raíssa. So can you stop sharing your screen? Just click on stop share.
Want to share or stop here?
Okay, wonderful. And now we invite questions from those of you in the room and those of you on Zoom. Just a reminder, on Zoom, you can ask questions in the chat, preferably in the Q&A feature, because that's easier to manage. And yeah, please, we invite your questions and comments. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the talk, and I'm really appreciative to learn about the connection between like the kind of Spanish-speaking countries and movements in Latin America and let's say Brazil, because there's often a divide between these two. So that's I think it's really important that you work on this. One question you mentioned in the beginning of the talk that that you see parallels between the FBI surveilling kind of anti-Nazi movements here in the United States in a very similar manner than the police in Brazil. Can you, or did you encounter in your work when you work with the police archive in Brazil, some kind of real connections between, like, say, police in Brazil and police here in the United States?
Well, actually, yes. There are two things that I would like to point out. First is how, identical the methods of cataloging that the FBI and the political police in Brazil use, like same forms and, same structure that they have. So it's very impressive. Like, it's impossible not to notice that. But also in the political police, they do mention contacts with the FBI. Because I think they shared some intelligence with each other. And it makes sense because I also found a very extensive file on it's called the German report in the FBI archive. That's over like 600 pages. And they have detailed information on every single anti-Nazi movement in Latin America. And from what I've seen from the Brazil section, they do seem to have contact, or at least know some of the names of higher-ups in the political police, like Filinto Müller appears there, and also one from São Paulo. So, but I'm still in the process of analyzing all that, and I hope to find more connections between the two of them. I think I don't know, I think there is a wider network of repression than I previously thought about.
Thank you.
You can call it. We have a question from Adriana. Thanks for your presentation, Raíssa. Fascinating topic. Have you found any evidence that the other Germany groups made an effort to help gain support for German or Austrian Jewish immigrants, refugees who had been deemed enemy aliens in other countries?
Wow. I think they were always in contact. I know that there are some overlap between the German community and the Austrian community. At first, before the Anschluss, they were working under the same organizations, and then there was a split. But well, I planned to get into that, but the Austrian archives in the political police of Brazil, they are very extensive, and I don't know, I think they deserve a thesis of their own. So, but there were some connections. There were, of course, movements that worked more closely with others, like the Freie Deutschland. It worked with anti-fascists everywhere. I think that the Dasendarie Deutschland was a little bit more like centered in the German identity, and then the anti-fascist struggle. And in Brazil, it depends. In São Paulo, they were a little more closed in themselves. In Rio de Janeiro, I think they were a little more open, and in Porto Alegre, they were in constant discussion with each other. Do I answer the question?
Good. What happened to the anti-Nazi resistance after 45? Did they know that high-ranking Nazi officials were seeking refuge in Latin America?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Almost all of these countries, they, after 45, those same people involved formed other, committees to educate and to prevent, the return of Nazism, like in Brazil. Stefan Baron, which was working with the FT, he formed the German Democratic Association. And it lasted until I think it was 52, or perhaps a little earlier, because he was actually arrested and deported. He was sent to, a terrible prison in Brazil, which he described it as worse than some concentration camps. But one of his main goals was to, form a program of continued education to stop these movements. I know that in Uruguay there were some people who started, a whole Nazi hunting movement when, because we interviewed one of the descendants, like her father was part of this movement, and she later came to Brazil. So in our project in the Arc Show, we have her interview. In Argentina, I know that there are some connections because Professor Steve Ross from the history department here, he actually told me that he knew of some material that after the war they were, trying to keep the resistance movements alive. And I don't know, this is what I know of. But like, for instance, in Mexico, most of the people who were working within these groups, like the Freie Deutschland, they actually immigrated to Oriental Germany, to Berlin. And they assumed like high-ranking posts in the government there. Eventually, they were killed one by one by Stalin, and over the next decade. And there is a very interesting book about this, about the fate of this Mexican resistance. And of course, some of them, particularly in South America, lots of people returned to Europe, in the 50s, probably, either to Switzerland, to Germany, to Austria, because the conditions, it was very hard to integrate, particularly speaking German. The jump from German to Spanish or to Portuguese is very hard to do. So for these people who actually worked with arts, with writing, start, writing in German to writing in Portuguese, not everyone could do it, but like some of them did. Willy Keller, for instance, he stayed in Brazil until his death. He was director of the Goethe Institute in Rio de Janeiro. So, and he actually translated lots of Brazilian plays into German and lots of German plays into Portuguese. But yeah, that was mostly it, I think. Did I answer your question?
Okay, you spoke of ideological differences between many of the groups, but I'm wondering if there was any move towards commonality in the differences between particularly US and Brazil involvement in the war, or after they became involved in it?
Well, it is an actual hard question because for these particular movements that I study, those people they didn't actually change their minds about the Brazilian government after or before. They still knew that Getúlio Vargas was like fascist government, and since they were actively writing to other movements during the years of repression, they had already proven themselves, I guess, to be open to connections both to the DAD and to the FD. So they were, both of the bigger movements, they were very open to these connections. They were trying to, they actually fought over territories and, memberships. Like, for instance, although the DAG had been in contact with Brazil longer than the FD, the fact that Lustig accepted the vice presidency of the Latin American Committee actually put some pressure on the DAG. They did try to, start parallel movements, but most of the anti-Nazi movement was already committed with Lustig, and it's flattering, I guess, to have a Brazilian in a vice presidency of a movement. And so I think, that there is the problem of, actual ideological questions, because even though the socialists and the communists faced a lot of the same problems, they nitpicked a lot of each other's movements, and they fought for the leadership, because that's what they meant about fighting for Germany's future. Like, both of these movements, they wanted, their ultimate goal was to create a government in exile in the American continent. And it would make a huge difference if the government was like in Buenos Aires or in Mexico City. And the US-based exile they were more complicated than it seemed, because they were also very divided. Like, for instance, if you stay within the Mann family, Thomas Mann did not actually believe in the other Germany. He was very, he was very criticized by other high-profile writers, even his brother, for not believing that. But he stood with this position. He, of course, he wanted to be part of war effort. He wanted to convince the Germans that, Nazism was wrong, but he'd never bought into the idea of the true Germany's theory. He was like, well, there is only one Germany, and if Hitler is in power, well, it's the Nazi one. It's our duty to take back. And it's worse, because while his son Klaus Mann advocated for the Allied nations to give a voice to the German refugees in deciding what would happen with Germany after the war, Thomas Mann was very, adamant to be like, well, we did not participate in the liberation of Germany. The people of Germany did not rise up against Hitler. So yeah, they have the right to decide what happens later. So there was never, a unified front, I guess.
So it didn't really matter too much which countries you were in or not in countries.
Were in. Yeah, it did not, because they weren't, actual citizens of these countries, they were Germans first and foremost. So, of course, they were anti-fascist. Well, at least the ones that spoke up, they were anti-fascist. So all of their advances were welcome in all these groups, I guess.
Yeah, so I have two questions from people who are interested in how the anti-Nazi movement clashed or worked with other groups. I have a question from Gustavo Dolci. It is my understanding that there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers amongst the existing German colonies in Brazil. Is my understanding correct? And if so, do you know if there were any kind of violence between them and the anti-Nazi movements and the people that you lectured about?
Yes, his understanding is correct. And there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers in the German community. And the fifth column, as it was called, was sort of strong. There are lots of works about it. One of the things that it actually interests me in getting into this research, it's because there are so many works about how there were so many Nazis in German Brazilian community, that I wanted to show that they were not all Nazis. There were people who spoke against Nazism, but yeah, and they clashed. They clashed at different points. They clashed in newspapers, but also physically in some ways. There are reports of that. They were denouncing each other to the political police, using its a repressive apparatus to their own means, so yeah. And I know that in other countries they faced similar problems, like Argentina. Wow. Argentina was a mess in that sense, because there is one thing that I didn't mention in my lecture, because it's a very complicated issue and I didn't want to, put it in the same basket as the other resistance movements. But there was the question of Autostrasser. Autostrasser had came to the American continent and established a movement that he also called Freie Deutschland. And he had lots of, media attention. Brazilian newspaper often republished his texts and everything. And he was, he was not an anti-Nazi resistance movement because he was also a Nazi, but he had differences over, Hitler's direction to the Nazi movement. So you could, generously called him an anti-Hitlerist. But in Argentina, the branch of the Autostrasser group had it boasted to have 6,000 members. So they often were criticized and clashed with the GAG, and it was a whole thing. And there were, of course, those people who were neither stressorists and neither resistance, and they were actual Nazis. So yeah, his understanding is correct.
And further, there are a lot of folks who are really interested in these interactions between different groups. And so I have Rodrigo Cerullo, excellent presentation, very eye-opening. My question is there any evidence of those anti-Nazi movements in the American continent working alongside refugees from other fascist governments from the same time, like Franco's Spain and Mussolini's Italy? And I'm going to add on to that because Pedro has asked a similar question, saying, Raíssa, congratulations for your wonderful presentation. And Pedro was also interested in knowing if there was in Brazil any communication between the German anti-Nazi groups and the contemporary Brazilian anti-fascist movements like ANL, National Liberationist Alliance, or these other anti-imperialist groups. So they're both interested in hearing about how anti-Nazi movements worked with other anti-fascist groups or refugees from other fascist governments.
In Mexico, they worked very closely with each other, like the Italian movement and the Spanish movement, first and foremost, like the international brigades. They were welcomed into the fold, and all of course, they paid more attention to the German refugees, but all were treated, as suffering from the same evil that was fascism. So in Brazil, I think that even though the police, when you take a look at the archives of the political police, you have the archive for the Free German movements, and then you have the Free Italian movements and the Free French movements. But from what I've seen, they did not work very closely with each other. I think the question of the language was very strong within these communities, because you have to understand that most of them did not speak each other's languages. They came to Brazil and they were struggling to learn Portuguese, but I've heard, for instance, one person who came from France, she was like, I spoke French for 2 years before I ever, uttering a word in Portuguese. And the Germans, they were like that. It was very hard for them, and then I think they, stayed within the community. But I know that some of them made some overture, particular like Friedrich Knistad, that was in Brazil longer than anyone else. He actually worked with the Spanish and the Italian movement. I don't think he worked with anyone else, but like, I don't know. I think that even though they faced the same problem that was like the fear of communists, the anti-communists, the leaning of the Vargas government, I think they mostly stayed within their own circles, I think.
I have a methodological question for you, which is a little bit cheating because it's something we've talked about. But in supporting your research, I know that some of the testimonies in the Visual History Archive are very richly indexed, the ones that were collected in Brazil. And some of them are not as specifically indexed, which has made it challenging for you to know whether anyone in that testimony is talking about the resistance movement that you study. Can you talk a little bit about how you found the testimonies and their accessibility, especially for people who are interested in working on Brazil?
Well, mostly I watched the testimonies, from beginning to end, because I try to focus on the ones in São Paulo because I did not have the time to, actually listen to the ones in Rio de Janeiro. But I tried, first I tried to search for like cultural activities groups or resistance groups or resistance fighters. And I didn't found, even when they were like listening to the testimonies, I heard like about some very important Jewish organizations or like partisans, and they were not tagged as such. And it's such a shame because, someone, looking to, I don't know, do research, that transnational research, a comparative one, they are probably going to think that there are less institutions in Brazil than there actually are. I tried then to search for names related to those people I was working with, and it came up with nothing. But because that was a tactic that worked with the Mexican and the Argentinian groups. They had like tagged in other relationships, the rabbi or the leaders. Like there was one testimonial in Mexico that described how a close friend of theirs was radicalized by Paul Merker or by Ludwig Wren. And in Brazil, I found nothing of the sort. And it's a pity because some of what I noticed, it's some of the indexing was very bare bones. They had the names of the family members, they had like the year they came to Brazil. And I tried to searching for that. One of the tactics that I used to listen to the interviews was to search for like Brazil from 39 to 45. And that worked a little bit because then I was able to, see how the people that came in the same time frame as my resistance group, how they were living, how the repression affected them. And it was very interesting. Unfortunately, I did not have the time to listen to all of them. And I don't know, I do hope that, if you guys have some funding to do that, that you will take another look at the Brazilian interviews because there is a very rich material there. And I know that some people in my laboratory in Brazil love to get their hands on these interviews because they are so rich. They have a lot of potential, and the indexing would help. And I know I completely understand why and the difficulties. We do have a problem with indexing in Brazil because, well, sometimes we do like the manpower, the funding and everything. So I completely understand the backstory here. But like it's worth it take a second look, because since there are no transcripts, I think they are very hard to access to international researcher, because you can't just copy the transcript and put it on Google Translate. But like for someone who knows what they are looking for, like was my case, I know a lot about this period. I interviewed many people. It was very interesting to see how much there is to work with there. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. So I have a question from Sandra Gunnar-Domi about, thank you for the great presentation. And during your anti-Nazi presentation, you talked a bit about the artistic activities. Could you tell us a little bit more, and if they were censored?
Oh, okay. So in Argentina, there are many records of artistic events that were hosted in the Pestalozzi school. But not only that, like for instance, there was the Freibund, the Deutsche Freibund, I don't remember exactly the name, but it was the Free German Theater, which was a space that was inaugurated by Paul Walter Jacob, and it played shows every weekend. It was very successful, and there was another group, like it was called Truppe 38, that their events actually financed a lot of activities for the DAD. They reverted, the tickets to funding for the other cultural activities. There were lots of, how can I say that, sessions for artists and painters and musicians mostly. So, there was an incentive to produce in exile. To write about the exile experience, to write about, what it means to be a German outside Germany. So in Brazil, we did have in Rio de Janeiro, I think the background was a little more rich, I guess. We had Ulrich Belcher, I think it's the name, which was a very famous poet, very important poet. And it was super interesting because he translated a lot of famous Brazilian poems to German. And he was very important to promoting a cultural exchange between the 2 countries, between the 2 cultures. He also translated lots of poems to Portuguese. Willy Keller, he actually was the first one to translate a very important Brazilian play, the Alto da Compadecida, which turned into Das Testament der Hund, and it's by a very important Brazilian playwright. So, and even Lustig Prean, when he came back to Austria, he directed an opera based in his experience in Brazil, and he incorporated several important Brazilian composers into the teams. So it even appeared in the newspapers in São Paulo. So there were a lot of cultural activities happening that, had exchanges between cultural exchanges. This was a very rich period for that. I think that because one of the things that you see, like when you're working with the testimonials, Brazilian testimonials, is that lots of people came to Brazil without knowing anything at all about the country. Like there was one lady who describes that she was very afraid of coming to Brazil because she thought she would have to live in the jungle with the monkeys. And when she came to Rio de Janeiro, she was so surprised because it was an actual city with buildings, tall buildings even. So, so this was very interesting. And some famous German writers, they, like Stefan Zweig, they've had a very romanticized vision of the country, but many of them living the day-to-day life, they became familiarized with the ins and outs of Brazilian society, and they were able to produce some very interesting, because it's interesting to see the point of view of someone who is not from that culture, writing about it. So In Mexico, I know that there were like writers club. There was the Heinrich Mann Writers Club, and I think there was. I think it was led by Ana Segers, and they had like workshops to foster, other writers, new coming writers. But I can't answer more than that.
Okay, we need to conclude, but we have just one more question on Zoom. So just please keep your answer brief.
Okay.
Oh, yes. And so this is from Andrea Appel-Preissing of the University of Leipzig. Thanks, Raíssa, for a very thorough presentation. My question is, the idea that fascism was a global threat was very popular in this time. I'm therefore interested in what it meant to be an anti-fascist in that contemporary Brazil, and if German-speaking refugees would agree with fellow Brazilians in labeling the government of Vargas as fascist.
Well, some German refugees would agree with the assessment that the Vargas government was a fascist one, like, for instance, Stefan Baron, because you had a very famous case of communist anti-fascist Ernst Joske, who was deported from Brazil. And well, he experienced Brazilian prisons, and he was very vocal about his distaste for the Vargas government. If you ask the Lustig-Brand, he wouldn't say that at all. He did not see the similarities between, the Vargas government and the Hitler and Hitler. Perhaps he could be hard-pressed to say that the Brazilian government had some similarities with Mussolini. But in Brazil, you did have, lots of critiques from the communist and anarchist movements to the Vargas government. And although I know that there are some intersections between those groups with the German groups, I did not explore them very deeply in my research. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you so much, Raíssa.